Good evening, everyone. I thought I would just give you a very quick overview of, I suppose, what the science says around cannabis and driving. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding around, I suppose, the extent to which cannabis does actually affect driving and how it affects it. Now, we generally break down the sort of research I do into experimental and epidemiological research. The experimental research is generally focused on laboratory controlled studies or randomized controlled trials, which are designed to look at essentially how, if you give someone cannabis and then you also give them placebo, to what extent does their performance change or what level of impairment is there? Now, I've run a couple of studies in this space, one that we ran quite recently in the Netherlands, where we actually took people out driving in traffic on the highway for 100 kilometers at two different time points after they had vaporized different kinds of cannabis containing different amounts of THC and CBD. And what we found was that overall, and bear in mind, these were people that were very stoned. These are people that use cannabis every now and again. They're not patients using it medically. They're people with relatively little experience with it. And they were quite intoxicated. The driving never really got any worse than what we would typically see in a driver with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. And so that was really telling. I think that suggests that the sort of impairment that we're seeing with cannabis is actually quite different from alcohol. While that level of impairment was similar, there was none of the usual patterns of effects that we would typically see with alcohol. People didn't drive more quickly. People were generally reluctant to drive. A few participants actually refused to drive because they were concerned around the risks associated with it. So we sort of saw the opposite. We didn't see that overconfidence that you generally see with alcohol. Instead, we saw a group of people that were reluctant to drive and did so because we were making them as part of a study, but generally would have chosen not to drive in real life if they were in that state. And for those that felt that they were okay to drive, they generally actually were okay to drive. Now, of course, this isn't to say that cannabis is completely benign when it comes to driving. There's cases when it can produce significant impairment, but that's not what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about people using it under prescription in controlled doses over time, and you do begin to develop tolerance. We've seen this now in a number of studies. There's, I suppose, quite a considerable body of evidence showing that people that use cannabis more regularly, that are used to its effects, that are using doses that are not intended to produce significant intoxication, but simply symptom relief, generally don't really show much impairment. There was also another really interesting study conducted in the Netherlands 10 years ago. And this was using two different doses of dronabinol, which is a synthetic THC product that's been used quite a while in patients. And they found that neither of the two doses they used and in people that use cannabis regularly was sufficient to produce any level of impairment at all. In people that use cannabis very infrequently, they weren't used to it, there was some impairment. But the people that were using it regularly and that were tolerant to its effects, no impairment at all, and less than what you would typically see in a driver with a legal BAC level of 0.05. Turning quickly to the epidemiological evidence, what this does is it looks at how cannabis impacts driving at a population level. So not at the individual, but at the population level. And it's now becoming pretty clear from this research, and this is really mirroring the findings from our experimental research, that your crash risk, if you have any amount of cannabis in your system, is estimated to be somewhere around 1.2 to 1.4. Now, if you have a BAC of 0.05, your crash risk is above 1.5. If you have a BAC of 0.08, it's well above 2 and it increases exponentially above that. If you have antidepressants in your system, your crash risk is actually closer to 2. Opioids, benzodiazepines, significantly worse. So we're sort of seeing a whole lot of emerging evidence now, which suggests that at a population level, cannabis doesn't actually impact crash risk to the same extent that some previous studies may have suggested. Now, at Swinburne at the moment, we've got a couple of studies going on that I think are really relevant to this debate. Both of these are actually, well, in one case, it's funded by Vic Rose. The other one's funded by the Department of Health and Human Services here. And these are really designed to probe some of these questions around cannabis and effects on driving in patients. So we've got one at the moment that's looking at detectability of THC in oral fluid. And without giving too much away, I can tell you that we're seeing wild variability in the results coming back from our roadside drug test that we're doing in the lab. Then we've also got another study that we're running now looking at chronic pain patients. We're tracking them over 3 months once they start using cannabis. We bring them into the lab before they use cannabis for the very first time, and we then track them for 3 months. We bring them in at monthly intervals, and then we can actually quantify effects on driving performance or cognitive performance. We can take blood and saliva samples, and so we can start to probe all these questions that we typically do with the kind of research that we run in our lab. So I think, we have quite a lot of evidence already that's showing us that the extent to which cannabis impacts your driving is heavily dependent on the way in which you use it. And by that, I mean tolerance, the types of THC doses that people are using, and also whether you're using it as a medicine. I mean, as Teresa was saying before, there's quite a lot of evidence that if you're able to reduce your opioid use, for example, other medicines that are known to produce impairment in and of themselves, or provide relief from an underlying condition such as chronic pain, which is also associated with impairment in and of itself, then you may end up with a sort of net neutral effect and potentially even a positive effect on driving. So these are all things that we're looking at in our lab. It's sort of heavy condensing of a lot of research into a couple of minutes, but hopefully that gives you, I suppose, some idea of where we're at and what the current state of science is around cannabis and driving.